You don't remember me, do you? Whispered the newlywed. I was the girl you left behind, mountain man. Snow needled the Colorado pines, a white veil hiding sins. Caleb Thornton rode low over Juniper's neck, along a ledge no wider than a boot heel, breath burning his throat. He wanted only a bed, hot coffee, trade his pelts and slip out before dawn. Then the bell tolled. Light spilled from the church like a coin while a fiddle chased the gale. The door opened. A bride drifted into the lamplight, lace bright as hoarfrost. She lifted her face and something old slammed into him. Missouri evenings, jars of fireflies, a girl who once swore he would come back. Her eyes found him across the drifted street. Time faltered. She smiled the way someone smiles while drowning. You don't remember me, do you? She whispered, the storm carrying every syllable. A gentleman in a sable coat stepped from the shadows and hooked an arm through hers. Edward Hargrove. Wealth walked in his boots. Possession lived in his knuckles. Caleb should have turned away. Instead, he saw what fear tries to hide. Powder dusting a yellowing bruise. A ribbon stitched with a tiny firefly. A wedding ring that sat too loose for vows made hours ago. Inside, the hymn slipped off key. The bell tolled again, though no one touched the rope. Snow hissed under the eaves. A scrap of paper skittered across the step, snagged his boot and lay open 3 careful words. Do not run. Juniper tossed her head. The gentleman leaned too close, lips moving while his smile stayed carved and cold. The door shut. The latch dropped. Music thinned to a thread and vanished. Caleb stood in the street with the note in his glove, heart kicking, past uncoiling like a rope. If the bride was Clara Mayfield, why stand with Hargrove? If she wasn't, who knew his name and why warn him now? Caleb guided Juniper through Pine Ridge, while snow thickened into a moving wall that scraped his cheeks and sought seams in his coat. The mare's breath curled in grey ropes. Hooves found purchase on boards, slipped on buried ruts, then steadied with a huff. Lanterns burned behind frost and turned every pane into a dim moon. A sign above the livery creaked like a door. Someone kept meaning to close. Chimneys drank the weather and gave back thin ghosts of warmth that died before they could bless the street. He kept his hat low and his eyes reading the ground, trusting the animal more than any map. Trade came first. Salt, flour, and a new file for traps. Then he would climb out before dawn, scabbed over the tracks he had cut coming in. That plan held until bells lifted through the squall like bright metal thrown high and caught again. The church at the square's far end glowed through the squall, a bright box pressed against slate sky. Wagons huddled in crooked lines. Fiddle music leaped, disappeared, then returned on a gust. A wedding had decided the mountain would not choose its hour. Caleb should have passed the corner and vanished into the livery, but the door opened, and the storm delivered a glimpse he could not refuse. Lace, lamplight, the lifted chin of a bride who felt known in the bones. Then the door closed. The glow turned private, and music went sly as if secrets could be kept by pitch alone. He pushed air through his teeth and moved on, telling himself he had imagined the shape of that face. Inside the livery, heat stung his face. Hay scent and warm hide pushed back winter. A boy with freckles littered like new copper across his nose hurried out, cap askew. Even Mr. I'll see to her. Caleb slid down, boots sinking to the ankle. Oats, rub down, blanket. She took the ridge like a sheriff. The boy grinned. Name's Tommy. Heard the bells. Mr. Hargrove is marrying a lady from back east. Folks say she's the prettiest soul that ever breathed rocky air. Caleb grunted, more sound than words, and unlashed the pelts. Tommy stroked Juniper's neck with care, then added, they say he owns half the freight passing through. Big house, big talk. Big temper when whiskey talks back. Caleb's hand paused on the strap, then finished without comment. Water her slow, he said. She'll drink herself sick if you let her. Tommy nodded, attentive as a pointer. The inn kept its porch swept even in weather like this. He stamped snow from his boots and stepped into a lobby that felt made for storms. An iron stove ticking, a plank floor scrubbed to a soft sheen, hooks crowded with coats that still breathed frost. The clerk drew him with a glance that measured strangers the way a trader weighed silver. Room? Caleb asked. Corner at the back, the clerk said, opening his ledger. Less draft, more quiet. Price named. Coin counted. Key slid across the counter. You might be here a spell, the clerk added. Sky looks mean, clear through to the divine. Caleb nodded, not trusting the voice with the weight sitting behind it. He did not stay in place. He carried what couldn't be carried and moved. The room held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window rimed in white ferns. He wiped a palm across the glass and pressed his brow to the coal. The church doors yawned again. People poured into the street, hats askew, cheeks high with color. Lanterns bobbed like small suns. In the swirl he found her, the bride, veil tugged by the gale, skirt lifted clean of slush by a hand practiced in grace. A man stood beside her, polished boots planted wide, coat brushed and glossy as a raven's wing. Edward Hargrove. Caleb didn't need an introduction. Power always wore itself with the same confidence. The man's hand curved over the bride's arm, guiding in a way that made guidance look like ownership. She turned her head and glanced toward the square. He could not swear she saw him through drift and distance. He felt seen anyway. He did not like towns. They echoed. They judged. They trapped a man in other people's talk. Yet he went back down to the stove for coffee and silence he could borrow. He took a chair, wrapped both hands around the tin cup, and let heat work through to the ache near his wrist, where cold always found him first. Words washed around him even though he had not asked for any. A freighter with wind-burned ears praised Hargrove's wagons and the money waiting in spring. A woman with red knuckles swore the dress had taken 3 weeks. That needle pricks had salted her sleep. A miner coughed until his face went dark, then grinned at the room like he had beaten something bigger than himself. The clerk steered talk, gentle as a ferryman, away from names that could buy trouble. The river of voices kept returning to the same bend. The bride from back east, the man who owned roots like other men owned boots, and the way the wind had rung the bell a second time, when no one stood near the rope. Caleb climbed to the little room and watched the square again. The groom leaned in close beneath the church eaves. The bride steadied herself with a gloved hand on the rail as if it were the most honest thing within reach. The sheriff's shadow crossed, then the light swallowed it. In the window he saw his own face reflected, drawn by winters, cut by work, marked by a pale crescent of scar a knife had left long ago. On that face, he read something he did not invite, an old promise waking up like a bear, coming out of a den before spring. Said it was time. He went back out to check Juniper, letting the storm's bite clear the fog that coffee could not touch. The livery smelled of leather, oats and steam rising from horse hides. Tommy had the mare blanketed, a brush moving in sure strokes that made her lids drift half closed. She's a good soul, the boy said. Takes to kindness. Most creatures do, Caleb answered. You staying past morning? Storm will tell me, Caleb said. The boy's grin tilted toward mischief. Storm and what else? Caleb raised an eyebrow and Tommy lifted both hands. Don't mind me. I hear more than I repeat. Juniper shifted, hip against the rail, already forgiving the road behind and the miles ahead. He took the long way around the square before returning to the inn. Boardwalks carried him past shut shops where painted letters showed through frost. General store, milliner, apothecary. A dog trotted up, sniffed his glove, then vanished beneath a stare with the confidence of someone who owned more than he let on. At the church, the final tune staggered to a stop, and silence fell hard enough to ring in the ear. Carriage wheels cracked the hush and cut clean tracks toward the east road. He glimpsed the couple on the far side of a wagon, the groom smiling in a way that hid teeth, the bride watching the ground as if it might answer a question no one else would admit existed. He ate stew that tasted of sage and rest, tore bread that steamed when broken, and felt his body remember warmth as a right instead of a borrowed favor. The clerk moved through the room with the quiet skill of someone who had watched winters break men and spared them judgment. Travelers set, cards clicked, laughter tried once then thought better of itself. Wind pressed its palm against the shutters and left a slow creak behind. He stretched out with a knife close to his breath and stared at the ceiling, until the grain resolved into long rivers that went nowhere. Roots unrolled in his head, out past the mill, across the creek if it crusted by morning, into the notch where the trail hooked left beneath the leaning pine. over white slabs that punished a man who paused. Another route he had not planned unspooled beside it. A street, a gate, a door he could knock if he let curiosity beat caution. He ground the heel of his hand against his chest as if he could press the thought flat. It rose again. Morning would come late behind lead sky. The past would dictate his choices. Yet the past had already reached across miles and years to change the lay of the land. He felt it as a pressure under the breastbone, where breath should sit easily. He had heard a whisper through a gale and seen a hand hold onto a rail as if faith lived there. He told himself he would trade, learn what the town knew and what it pretended not to know, and keep clear of quarrels that belonged to other men. The truth sat in the room anyway, stubborn as an old wound. A sleigh jingled once and faded. Somewhere a door latched, the sound small and final. He rose, crossed to the window, and set his palm against the pane until cold burned through skin to bone. Out on the square, a lantern guttered, flared, then steadied, stubborn as life on the last ring. He remembered a summer fence line, a jar bright with fireflies, a promise made by a boy who thought distance could excuse forgetting. Isolation had kept him alive. Connection, unwanted, had found him anyway. Have you ever seen someone from your past and felt time stop? Share a moment that changed everything in the comments below. Let's connect over those memories that linger. Sleep refused him. Wind clawed the shutters and worried a loose pane, as if fingers sought a way in. Caleb lay on the narrow mattress with his knife under one palm, while the storm's moan threaded the boards like old grief. Memory made its own weather. Clara at 10, chin tipped high, daring him to climb the cottonwood that leaned over the creek. Clara at 12, racing dusk along fence lines with fireflies pulsing in jars. Clara the last night in Missouri, hair damp from heat, voice steady as she asked when he would return. And his answer soon spoken by a boy who thought distance excused forgetting. The gale pressed a fresh drift against the wall, and he tasted spruce pitch and regret. Before dawn scuffed the roofs with gray, he pulled on his coat and gloves, went down to the stove, where embers smoldered beneath ash, and poured coffee dark as wet bark. Heat walked his veins. Outside, the air had thinned to a dry sift. Flakes ticked against clapboards like sand through an hourglass. He crossed to the livery. Breath from the stalls rolled in pale clouds. Horses shifted, chains clicked, leather creaked. Juniper snorted and nuzzled his sleeve, her forelock iced with tiny stars. Tommy stood on a stool, brushing a bay, freckles bright against wind-burned skin. "She's eaten," the boy said. "Didn't bolt the water either, like you warned." Caleb ran his palm along Juniper's neck, feeling sound muscle beneath the blanket. "She knows her limits," he said. The brush paused. "You hear the talk?" Tommy dropped his voice, as if the rafters had ears. "Mr. Hargrove's got contracts from here to Platte Crossing. Freight, warehousing, winter stores, the ice house comes thaw. Half the goods that move in or out touch his ledgers first. Folks say he keeps the sheriff tidy and the judge comfortable." Caleb's jaw worked once. "And a wife," Tommy glanced toward the door. "Came fast after her mama passed. Trained in Leadville, hired a coach from there. Made like a chalk stick, don't speak unless spoken to. Some say the lady looks at windows as if they're rivers. Some say bruises bloom where lace can hide them. Nobody says anything plain." By full light, the drifts stood like dunes along the boardwalks. Heat, noise, and information traveled together, so he went to the corner saloon. Batwings gave way to a breath of whiskey, tobacco, and damp wool. Men hunched over cards. Others leaned at the bar watching reflections blur in bottles. A freighter with a scar that bent one brow raised two fingers. Caleb set the coin on the plank. Coffee. The barkeep poured black as tar into a chipped mug and slid it across without a smile or scorn. The scarred freighter tapped his cup. "Temper on that gentleman," he said. "I hauled for him 3 months back. The clerk shorted me $3. I spoke. Hargrove smiled like a knife when light finds it and told me I miscounted. I said I hadn't. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to." 3 men who eat his bread turned toward me like pointers. I took the loss and my teeth home. A miner coughed until his face went slate, then rasped. First wife fell, they say. The freighter snorted, fell down a flight every day of her life, by the look of it, and then finished the job on the stairs. Cards paused mid-air, boots stilled. Another voice, quieter, spoke from a back table. Doc stitched me that afternoon. The speaker, he saw a mark behind her ear not shaped by a step. Silence sat down among them, like a third player at a two-hand game. The barkeep resumed his rag in slow circles, polishing absence. Sheriff keeps order, he said. Order bends toward coin. He topped Caleb's mug as if resolve could be poured. Caleb drank, tasted iron under the bitterness, and left before talk turned to him. The street bit clean as a knife. He paced the length of the square, reading faces the way he read a ridge. For strain, for give, for slide. The dressmaker stepped out with pins in her mouth, saw him, removed them, and said nothing, though curiosity burned behind her eyes. The sheriff passed with collar up and hands buried, nodding once before looking away, as if eye contact cost money he could not spare in lean weather. Storefronts held the same caution. Money had chosen a side. Most folks prefer to live where money sleeps. He let the square carry him to the general store and lingered over lamp oil and flints. He did not need. The bell above the door jangled. Boots crossed the threshold, followed by a hush like cold water poured on coals. Clara entered with a maid behind, veil down, bonnet brim shadowing her cheek. She walked to the counter as if counting boards might keep her upright. The clerk bowed lower than courtesy required. Needles, she said, blue thread, salts. Her voice hardly touched the air. She kept her face presented to the ledger, but when the clerk reached for a bottle, the bonnet lifted a fraction, and he saw the edge of a bruise at the hairline, the color of fading violets, dusted with powder. The maid saw him and slid a half step to block his line. Clara paid with exact coin, then let a square of linen fall from her glove as she turned. He stooped for it because blue thread had drawn a small creature he knew better than his own name. A firefly arced across the corner, wings raised, body curved as if about to lift. He held the cloth and looked up. She did not meet his gaze. She did not need to. The small jump at her throat told him more than any glance. He offered the handkerchief. She reached without brushing his fingers, took it and tucked it fast. Thank you, the maid said, brisk as a latch. The two moved to the door. The clerk scribbled. Chalk cracked. The bell jangled again. Caleb stood until stillness felt dishonest. The clerk cleared his throat. Anything else? Caleb set coins for oil. He did not require, walked under the awning, and breathed a fog that turned to frost in his beard. The street shone brighter and colder at once. He let the truth he had kept behind his ribs step forward. Clara Hargrove was Clara Mayfield, with new letters nailed on like a sign. Grief had pushed her west. Marriage had promised shelter. Money had locked the door. Pride held the key in the same pocket as the deed. He took the alley behind the stores. Barrels cupped blown snow. The doctor's shingle swung on iron hooks, scuffed by the wind. Caleb knocked once. A gray man with steady eyes regarded him, the way a river regards a stone. It must pass. You need tending? No, Caleb said. Only a word. The doctor waited, carved from restraint. Talk walks, Caleb said. Some of them wear a coat. The doctor's gaze did not move. A physician observes. He answered. He does not announce. Caleb held the silence until it went taut. If a man locked a room from the outside and called it an accident, would you sleep? The doctor's jaw flexed. Sleep comes hard in winter. He closed the door with care, not rudeness. Afternoon leaked into lead. Caleb returned to the inn and sat where he could see the door and the window together. Foot traffic thick. Shadows stretched into one long bruise across the square. He took the linen from his breast pocket and traced the stitched wings with his thumb. Heat seemed to run from cloth to rib, as if the thread carried a coal. He counted reasons to leave that looked like duty rather than fear. Each failed when held to light. Every justification to go built the shape of a man who had turned away once already. Danger here dressed as wealth. It shook hands, funded bridges, and sent baskets to the harvest fair. It owned roots, bought silence, and smiled with one side of its mouth, while the other side counted. He had survived by choosing trails that kept him out of other men's fights. That rule had saved him too many times to scorn. Yet rules break when they meet the one thing they were not built to face. He had heard a whisper through the wind, seen a mark hidden under powder, and held a sign stitched by the very child he had left behind. He felt the mountain inside him tilt. Night fell like a weighted blanket. He climbed to his room, lay down without undressing, boots on, knife under palm, the handkerchief above his heart. The building breathed. Drifts shifted against stone with a slow hiss, as though snow had learned speech and practiced it under ease. He closed his eyes and saw Clara walking a white street with courage as stubborn as the ridge's spine, fear tucked neat and hidden like a bruise under silk. He made a promise without flourish, and knew he would keep it. He would stay until he knew she was safe. Law or no law, storm or no storm, and he would cross a man like Hargrove if there proved no other path. Caleb found Clara on the boardwalk, when morning scraped a thin blade of light across Pine Ridge and left the rest to wind and grit. She stood with a parcel tucked to her ribs, bonnet low, veil of frost across her cheek, the posture of someone who knew eyes lived in windows and that daylight could be safer than any whisper. He lifted 2 fingers to his brim and left space enough to satisfy every watcher. "Walk with me," he said, voice for open air, not confession. She measured the street doors, windows, the sheriff's office, the church steps, the hill where the big house sat like a clenched fist, and gave one small nod. "Only here," she murmured. "Only where people look." "Only here," he answered, and matched her stride, half a step toward the gutter to keep slush from her hem. Hands loose, gaze forward. For a time the only talk came from hinges and bells. The apothecary door chimed and coughed. The milliner's latch clicked. A sleigh's trace jingled once and vanished. Then her voice found shape. "He is different now," she said. "Since the vows, he drinks. Last night, he hit me." The words were plain, unornamented, the way truth is when a person has spent the night sanding it down so it will pass through a narrow door. Heat rose behind Caleb's teeth. He kept it there. "Leave," he said evenly. "I will see you to the path. There are cabins in the forks and hands that owe no one here a favor." She let out a breath that wanted to laugh and had learned better. "The law makes me his," she said. "Where would I go with a ring that ties my name to his ledger? The sheriff keeps the peace with his coin. The judge eats at his table. A woman alone is a rumor, and rumors starve." A wagon lurched by to avoid a splash. She stepped closer for the span of a heartbeat, glove brushing his sleeve. Not a stumble, a choice. "I am not asking for rescue. I cannot claim," she said. "I am asking to remember I am not a story he tells." "You are Clara Mayfield," he said softly. "Not his invention. Names travel poorly," she replied. "He rewrites arrivals. He rehearses departures. He counts doors and knows which hinges scream." Powder masked a fading mark near her hairline, the violet edge of something that did not come from a clumsy rail. They turned at the church so the square could witness without thinking it had discovered anything. Men shouldered fiddle cases. Women carried tins, cheeks raw from wind and work. Talk broke and reformed like sleet at the curb. A curtain stirred, then stilled. He kept his hands visible. She breathed in time with the gusts, learning a pace the marriage had not assigned. At the inn he asked for hot water and bread. The clerk nodded, as if such errands grew naturally from the weather. They stood near a window where light made faces plain and poured heat into stiff fingers. After 2 swallows, she set the cup against her lip and spoke just loud enough that the room would keep the secret by being forced to hear it. "He locked my door and threw the key into the ash bucket. He said vows give a man rights, and rights prefer silence." Caleb's palm found the knife hilt in his coat, not to draw, only to anchor the anger that wanted its own work. "There was breaking," he said. The hill carried sound. "He breaks what can be replaced," she answered. "He never marks what a seamstress cannot promise to mend." The corner of her mouth tightened and loosened. "He is clever as ice." "Clever cracks," Caleb said. "A thaw comes." She weighed hope the way a trapper weighs steel for balance and bite. "Thaw feeds rivers," she said. Rivers carry bodies. I am not law, he admitted. I am not the judge he pays. I am a man who knows doors and windows, and how locks think when whiskey puts them to sleep. She adjusted a glove, that small delay which is equal parts etiquette and plea. Do not meet him in his hall, she whispered. He wants an audience. He performs for crowds. His rage needs mirrors. I will not give him a stage, Caleb said, hearing the mountain in his own voice. The sheriff paused in the doorway and looked through them with professionally empty eyes, then moved on. The clerk lifted a kettle with elaborate care, letting steam make louder talk than rumor. Clara gathered her parcel. I have hymns to copy, she said. At the sill her balance tipped, perhaps real, perhaps theater, and her fingers rested on his sleeve long enough to leave a warmth that reached skin through wool. When the latch fell behind her, he pressed his palm to that patch and felt courage borrowed and owed. The innkeeper set down a plate he had not ordered. Yelling up the hill, the man said softly, naming the weather, glass after, quiet then. Lamps burned past midnight. She locked her own door from inside. He owns the sheriff, Caleb said. He rents him, the clerk replied. Rent can lapse. Owners can be embarrassed. He met Caleb's eyes. You will not win against the front wall. Chip the footing. What passes for footing? Ledger lines and freight, the clerk said. Promises written twice and paid once. A man who controls routes forgets storms. Choose roads. Ask teamsters about crates that change their weight in the night. Ask the doctor what patterns bruises prefer. Caleb ate so a body would have fuel for patience. Paid anyway and stepped into air that cut clean as spirit. At the livery he put a hand on Juniper's neck and gave Tommy a chore that would keep ears open and mouth shut. Count which wagons load after dark, he said. Learn which roll out lighter than they went in. The boy's freckles sharp. So the books say one thing and the snow says another. Snow tells the truth, Caleb answered. Afternoon pressed down until the tin grazed the cloud. He walked back lanes where frost ringed barrel hoops, and smoke threaded from chimneys in straight, careful lines. Rage spun its wheel. He let it, then forced it to slow. He pictured himself at the iron gate, shouting until blood answered blood. And he pictured the morning after when gossip would strike what fists had missed. He scraped that image away and drew another. A man waking to find certainty leaking from the bottom of his story. Dusk found Clara again, basket under linen, blankets folded from the church. Her pace did not change when she saw him, but a slight shift in her shoulder gave permission to join her at a corner, where the wind dropped and the lamplight pooled. He asked who gave me the bruise, she said in the tone of someone reporting the river has risen. I told him the rail. He smiled and said, rails do not strike twice. Will he drink tonight? Caleb asked. He likes to win before sleep, she answered. Drink helps him believe the mirror. If a door opens, he said, I will stand where you can find it. She put her hand on his sleeve again, and this time it was a vow. If a door opens, she whispered, I will walk through. If no door opens, do not die against it. I have outlived worse winters. Not this kind, she replied, and moved away with the composure of a lady the town preferred to imagine, back straight, pace even, a portrait that made other people comfortable. He watched until the hill took her, then went to the saloon, and bought coffee he did not need while listening to seams of praise until he heard thread. He could pull a driver grumbling about crates that weighed less in daylight than on the scale at dusk. A clerk bragging too loud about duplicate receipts. Silence from the doctor that rang louder than talk. He kept his face empty and his ears open, then climbed to the small room and sat with the handkerchief in his palm, the firefly she had stitched when both of them believed jars could keep light. He measured reach against walls he could not command. He could not write orders. He could hurt a story until the man telling it had to answer questions he could not dodge. He would follow routes in snow and ink, gather ledgers that did not balance, watch doors and choose a night when pride slept like any beast, making space where none admitted to live. The storm returned in a whispering way that works at seams. He lay down in his boots with the knife under his palm. Anger banked like a coal, and fed it facts instead of noise. He promised the dark that he would not leave while danger wore Clara's ring, and that he would not give Hargrove the theater he craved. Ever felt trapped by someone else's choices? Tell us about a time you wanted to help but couldn't. Your stories keep this tale alive. Caleb moved like a shadow along the hill where Hargrove's mansion crouched behind iron and disciplined spruce. Snow had set into a crust that sang under careless boots. He stepped in the old deer prints along the lilac hedge, so the yard kept its silence. Window panes breathed a wavering gold, lamps trimmed low to flatter wealth. Somewhere inside, a clock cleared its throat with prim regularity. He let the house speak. Walls confess when night grows patient. A sob cut the glass, thin, unvarnished, real. He eased toward a side window, half-curtained with lace. The room beyond held a writing desk, a coal grate banked to a sullen glow, and a chair turned toward the wall as if conversation offended it. Clara's voice broke like river ice. "Please," she said, not pleading, budgeting breath. "Please stop." The answer came in a low growl that used language like a rope. "You'll not shame me with that trapper." Smooth, rehearsed, the kind of threat polished on other people's pain. Caleb's hand closed on the sill until cold bit through leather. The pain fogged and cleared with the room's breath. Footsteps crossed, a bolt slid, the lamp flattened to a smear, and silence grew large enough to choke a man. He measured choices the way a mountaineer reads cornices. Break the glass, lift her out, bleed in the yard while money called itself the law. Or wait, take proof from ledgers and mouths, until even rented officials could not pretend blindness. He mouthed patience and tasted iron, then slipped back along the hedge and took the rear lane to the square. Pine Ridge wore the storm's last rag. Wind threaded the eaves with a thin, needling note. Inside the saloon, lamplight slouched across sticky tables and pooled around boots. A freighter hunched at the bar, coat skewed, jaw blue with stubble. "Whiskey," the man croaked, then noticed Caleb and grinned without humor. Another ghost looking for company. The barkeep poured, unimpressed. Caleb set a coin. "Tell me about the lady who fell." The freighter's gaze moved slowly as cattle through a gate. "Hargroves first," he said. "Pretty thing from Omaha. Wore gloves in mud and smiled anyhow. Learned that stairs bite." He drank and winced. "Bruises before that tumble. Saw them when she slipped me a note for the post. Purple rings where lace sits, yellow clouds like fog on wheat. She kept her chin like a hymn." He gave a single empty laugh. "Then she missed a step and took the whole flight. Sheriff wrote it as a misstep." Caleb asked. "Household accident," the barkeep answered, polishing the same clean plank. "No one ruins supper with facts." The freighter leaned in, breath sour with a week's wages. "You think money builds shelter," he said. "Sometimes it builds silence and calls it shelter, so folks won't notice the door has no outside handle." He straightened, wary now. "You didn't hear that from me." "I heard it from a man with eyes," Caleb said. The barkeep's rag slowed. "Eyes fail when fear pays for shade." The doctor answered a late knock after a pause long enough to weigh risk. Lines ran like dry riverbeds down his cheeks. His spectacles flashed like small shields. "You again," he said. "You ask questions that erode friendships. Friendship shouldn't mind erosion when rot runs under it." Caleb replied. The physician's mouth twitched, a private smile at a joke he would not own. "Briefly," he said, setting a lamp on the table. Caleb kept accusation out of his tone. "You examined Clara. The marks on her arms are not from last night alone." The doctor studied the lamp chimney until the glass turned his face to water. "A physician observes," he said at last. "Purple fading to yellow speaks to timing. Clustered rings speak to method. I treat what is brought to me. The rest belongs to men who swear oaths." "Men who rent their oaths," Caleb said. The doctor's jaw moved once. "I still stitch," he answered, and shut the door with care, not cruelty. On the way back he read fear in the town's posture. Shutters latched too tight. Dogs muzzled by owners who knew barking draws notice. Women skimming from door to door with children tucked like parcels. Wealth had taught Pine Ridge to bow without bending. Folks called that prudence, because the word cowardice skinned too close to the bone. He did not blame a widow for guarding her fire. He blamed the man who used that instinct to crown himself. Under the milliner's awning, the maid passed him, moving briskly, eyes fixed on the middle distance in the way service learns. Her apron pocket sagged with folded paper. He followed at a range that would not spook a deer. She turned into the alley by the post, where wind chased trash along a fence and a crate tapped with every gust. She knelt, fumbled, pretended to tie a shoe, left a slip under the crate, rose and walked on without a glance. He waited until two teamsters tramped by and a sleigh rattled past, then reached under the wood. Ink in a hand he knew from summer chores curled across the scrap. "I'm scared, but I remember you." He let out the breath chained to his ribs since the church door opened. He folded the note and pressed it against that steady place in a man no winter quite freezes. The words did not beg. They confirmed. Hope counted him alive. He spent the afternoon braiding evidence. At the freight yard a foreman weighed crates twice and wrote 2 numbers. Caleb asked nothing and learned everything. A driver swore under his breath about phantom sacks that traveled fine on paper and vanished on the trail. Caleb handled ropes, soothed a nervous mule, and kept his ears open wider than his mouth. By dusk he could have walked the warehouse blind. By dark he had copied invoice numbers into a small book he hid in his boot between wool and leather. The pattern spoke fluently, goods that grew lighter by night, receipts doubled under different hands, routes that bent around the same cold name. Back at the inn the clerk slid a tin box across the counter, as if offering change. Inside, under folded newsprint, lay cancelled notes with the same tidy margin hand, totals that drifted obediently wrong week by week. "I sweep," the man said softly. "Sometimes I find dust." "You sweep thoroughly," Caleb answered. "People track in the weather. I keep floorboards honest." The clerk tilted his chin toward the hill. "You will need something louder than ledgers." "I will need both," Caleb said, closing the box. Noise without proof is a fist in fog. When night pinned frost stars to every pane, he climbed again. The mansion sat quiet as a held breath. He circled to the kitchen yard, counting windows, measuring spans, marking which doors swelled from steam and which held dry. A coal cart squealed, a footman cursed. Upstairs a piano tried a phrase and abandoned it, as though harmony feared to linger. He found the lace-lit window again. Clara stood inside, back straight, hair braided thick, eyes on a locked door. She did not see him. She lifted a handkerchief, pressed it to her throat, and for one heartbeat the cloth's embroidered firefly flashed in the lamplight, a tiny creature stitched from courage. The lamp dimmed. A key turned elsewhere in the house. Footsteps passed like a slow saw through seasoned wood. He melted into shrub shadow until the yard exhaled. Down at the square, the stars burned like cold nails. The storm had cleared, yet the air felt tighter, strung to a pitch that promised snapping if one more weight hung from the wire. Pine Ridge had become a trap waiting for a boot. He understood the spring, the bait, the teeth. Hargrove believed he owned the trail. Men like that mistake path for possession. The mountain corrects them. He went once more to the saloon and set whiskey beside coffee, so no one would call him a saint. "To absent friends," he said, and drank the coffee. Resolve settled like a stone in deep water. He would protect Clara, law or no law. He would use snow, ink, rumor, and night. He would take the town's fear, bend it through proof, and turn it back on the man who had taught them quiet. He tucked the note inside his shirt, palm flat for a moment over the words, a pledge sealed by breath and heat. Then he paid and stepped into the hard, singing cold. The wind had stopped, but tension had its own weather. Lanterns burned with guarded steadiness, as if even flame had learned caution. A sleigh bell chimed once and went still. Hargrove's house threw a last slice of light across the hill, then shuttered it. Caleb looked at the dark shape, the iron fence, the disciplined trees, and felt a clean line draw inside his chest. He had followed signs across avalanche basins and through canyons where sound dies. This hunt would be no different. Tracks had been laid, bruises masked by powder, ledgers that refused to meet, a doctor's careful silence, a freighter's weary truth, a girl's stitched firefly, and a note that said he had not dreamed the past. The storm had finally moved on, a new pressure had taken its place. Pine Ridge held its breath like a sprung trap waiting for a boot. He put his heel down. Fire burst behind Hargrove's stables with a cough of orange, then climbed hard, greedy as wind. Caleb smelled pitch, heard wood crack, and ran from the livery before thought could argue. Over the roar came a thin cry from the gable room above the tack loft, then a rasping cough that belonged to the same voice he had heard in a church doorway. He cut through the crowd, found the tool shed by feel, and seized an axe with a hickory handle polished by years of labor. He raked hair from his eyes with a sooty knuckle, wrapped his scarf over his nose and mouth, and ran straight into the door where planks had started to bow. He hit the latch with his shoulder, found it barred, set the axe head to the seam, and struck until iron screamed and wood gave. Inside burned like a kiln. Oil had found straw, straw had found rafters. He kept low, counting breath, counting heartbeats, counting the strikes he could afford. Smoke clawed at his lungs. At the landing, a locked door blocked the hall. Iron banded warm to the palm. Behind it, coughing scraped into a small thud. He swung. The axe bit, stuck, tore free, bit again. Splinters spun. A gap opened and coughed flame. He drove a boot through and shouldered the frame until the wood yielded. Smoke rolled across the floor in a hot river. The small room held a narrow bed, a chest, and a window gone black from the inside. Clara crouched by the floorboards with her shawl over her mouth, eyes watering, hair frayed loose from its braid. She lifted her head because a body knows a name when danger says it without sound. He did not talk. He lifted her, turned, and went back through the slit he had made, body between heat and the small weight in his arms. The corridor spat sparks. A tread failed. He jumped the gap and landed with a jolt that rang his knees. On the ground floor, the doors held, swollen by steam. He set Clara on his hip, took 3 steps, and hit with the side of his shoulder. Night rushed in like water after a dam gives way. He staggered into the cold that cut his throat and made the first clean breath burn. Hands reached, then withdrew, unsure of how to help a man who had brought fire out in his arms. He lowered her onto a sled plank near the pump, where air moved cleanest, and tilted her forward so coughing could finish its work. Soot spilled in thread. Breath steadied from ragged to thin, then to a rhythm that might last. The doctor arrived at a run, knelt and set fingers to her wrist, then to the pulse at her neck. He checked pupils, peeled back glove and sleeve, pressed gently along wrist. She needs air, not speeches, he said to no one, and everyone. He found bruises in the shapes that tell time, yellow ghosts beneath powder at the hairline, clustered rings along the forearm, the livid edge of a newer blow near the shoulder. Clara tried to speak. The doctor held water to her lips and shook his head. Not yet. She swallowed, coughed again, and stared at Caleb as if fixing her sight on the one solid thing left in a world that had turned to smoke. Hargrove reached the yard with his hair tidy and his boots clean, alarm arranged across his face like a polished mask. He glanced at the broken door, at the axe on the snow, at Clara on the plank, then addressed the crowd with patient regret. The lock jammed, he said. I sent a boy as soon as I heard. Winter swells wood. Caleb stood, smoke-streaked, eyes raw, and let his voice travel to the far ring where doubt lived. Locked from outside, he said. I crossed the bolt before I struck. The bar faced the hall. The murmur that followed had weight. The sheriff pushed through with 2 deputies who had not chosen which way to lean. He looked at the frame, at the stair gap, at the doctor's hand resting on marks that told their own chronology. Duty found him in stages, like Thor edging down a slope. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, granting the courtesy the badge required. "You'll answer questions." Hargrove sighed as if patience were a service. "Sheriff, accidents multiply in storms. Servants miss here. My wife fainted. Hinges fail." The doctor rose and met his gaze. "Bruises do not fail," he said. "They repeat." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Silence around him thickened, until the fire's crackle sounded small. Hargrove smiled with only one side of his mouth. "Doctor, be prudent." Caleb stepped closer to the ruined door. "Be precise," he said. "Your jammed lock wore soot on the hall side." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "We will look," he said. "Tonight." He nodded to the deputies. Buckets moved again as men smothered the last tongues of flame. Steam lifted where snow met ember and drifted into the dark like a ghost, deciding not to stay. "Bring her inside," the doctor said, reclaiming the room from noise. Caleb bent, slid his arms under Clara again, and felt her hand find his coat, a grip that admitted weakness without surrendering will. She whispered so only he could hear. "You saved me again." He bowed his head until his brow touched her hair. "I'll keep saving you," he said, a promise shaped like breath. He carried her through space. The crowd opened, steps clearing as if the town itself had decided to make a path. Women ran ahead, lighting the doctor's porch with lamps that threw steady circle. Inside, warmth gathered without malice. The doctor set Clara on a narrow bed near the stove, raised her shoulders with folded quilts, and listened to her chest, until relief softened his shoulders. "No broken ribs," he said. "Minor burns. She will need rest, water, quiet and time." Caleb fetched the cup the doctor pointed at and held the cup while Clara drank in small, stubborn swallows. Outside, steam rose where snow met ember. Inside, steadiness returned in inches. The sheriff's questions drifted through the window. Names, times, facts pinned before the story could wriggle free. Hargrove's voice moved among those words like oil on water, shiny and thin. Caleb stood long enough to see the badge turn toward duty under 100 watching eyes. He thought of crooked ledgers, of roots that grew lighter by night, of bruises that refused the tale of swelling wood. Tonight had burned away polite doubt. Pine Ridge had seen a door barred from the wrong side, and a woman carried out of a room that should never have been locked. The town held its breath, waiting to see whether truth would be allowed to stand. Caleb squeezed Clara's hand once, and felt her answer, faint and certain, like a pulse finding its way home. "Who's been your hero in a dark moment?" Share their story below. Let's honor those who stand up when it counts. At the doctor's house, Clara rested beneath quilts, warmed by a stove and sunlight that burned paths across the kitchen table, her breathing shallow but steady after the smoke and the night's terror. She ate spoonfuls of broth like a person counting small mercies, each swallow a tiny reclaiming of courage that the fire had tried to steal. The letter from Philadelphia lay folded on the bedside, an offer for work as a governess that promised steady hands, a safe house, and the slow, certain anonymity she craved. When she spoke of her mother's death, it came as a catalogue of necessary facts rather than a broken confession. Illness, funeral, a lack of kin who could stand against the hard promises of men who trade in needs and then bill for shelter. Hargrove arrived in the months that followed, with tidy phrases and louder assurances, offering protection that felt warm until seams began to separate and small cruelties accumulated until they read like a pattern. Caleb watched her describe the way he closed doors and counted coins as if counting breath, the private violences that gather until they become a single, undeniable map. He folded the governess's letter and smoothed it as if paper could be ironed into a future, then took his own measures of the town like a man who maps safe routes by memory and habit. News that ledgers had been inspected traveled faster than a winter wind, when a judge and a few steady citizens finally chose to listen, and the shape of Hargrove's business emerged in ink, in duplicate receipts, in freight notes that did not match the loads that left his yards. Caleb carried copies wrapped in oilcloth to the judge's chamber, the little book against his chest, a proof he could feel as if it were a new pulse. The judge read names and numbers with hands made steady by duty, and things that had been kept in shadow rose like drowned objects to surface in daylight. Neighbors gathered in drifts along the shop fronts, whispering the way people do when suspicion becomes language, and language must be shared to feel less poisonous. Hargrove bristled at the summons with practiced composure, finishing sentences before they were started as if performance could shorten consequence. But the paper arrived with legal weight that made the town hold its breath like a taut rope. Formal arrest followed with the small ritual of lock and key, and for a little while the town leaned toward justice as something possible rather than an idea. Caleb allowed himself a narrow hope, foolish but necessary, that exposure would undo the rot Coin had planted. Yet power that grows in shadow practices escapes, and Hargrove, accustomed to buying options with money and muscle, found a night route that turned stability into a sea. In the smallest hours when snow crusted in the yard and chimneys breathed slow, the jailer discovered a gap where routine had been, and a cell unlocked with a silence that smelled of haste. By dawn a horse stood saddled and a gate hung open, as if a man had simply chosen to walk away. Men muttered about hired hands and quick departures, and a note appeared like a shard left in the street. Noon, Main Street, come alone. Caleb brought that brittle demand to Clara, and the paper pressed like a stone in his palm when she read it. She folded her face into the quilts, as if the cloth might shelter fear from the man who had already vowed to stand. She offered the Philadelphia letter again and said plainly she wanted peace more than spectacle, explaining that the governor's post promised a life that did not require being the subject of a town's drama, or the target of a man's theatrical cruelty. Caleb argued only once about her taking a hired escort. He knew the kind of silence that comes from bargains struck with men steeped in intimidation, and he hated the price of safety paid in surrender. Instead, he mapped escapes and watched, choosing exits and angles with the obsessive care of someone who moves by routes and knows how ambushes arrange themselves. He spoke quietly with the judge about ways to widen the net and constrain Hargrove's reach, while also preparing for the inevitable hour when the man might try to make an accusation into a spectacle. Clara packed a small trunk with clothes that would not proclaim wealth and slipped the Philadelphia offer inside like a seed for another spring, tucking a faded ribbon from childhood into the folds as if sewing a bridge between what had been and what might be. Her eyes met Caleb's with gratitude threaded through fear, and in that look he understood the cost of standing between her and a violent past. Word moved through the town that Hargrove had hired passing men with low voices and steady hands, and their presence made neighbors speak in quieter tones, as if lowering the sound would hide them from consequence. Caleb taught Tommy to read wagons by sound and weight, to watch for horses that bore marks of hurried departures, and he arranged for neighbors to keep odd hours and for witnesses to stand where a scene would be public rather than private. He catalogued angles and sightlines, and asked the judge to assemble men with nothing left to trade for silence, those whose testimony would not be bought, and who would stand in daylight with the ledgers between them and Hargrove. On the morning before noon, Clara folded a tiny bundle with such care that the small acts of preparation spoke louder than any speech, and she pressed the governess's offer into Caleb's hand with the simplicity of a woman choosing a new life over a contest she did not want. She asked him not to go to Main Street alone, her voice steady though small, and Caleb answered with the blunt truth of a man who knows what happens when wrong is left unchallenged. He would not barter protection for surrender. They planned for witnesses, for law brought into the open, and for the removal of any stage Hargrove might prefer. When the day came, the square filled with faces that pooled from doorways and windowsills, a crowd that held its breath like a thing afraid to wake the wind. Hargrove arrived polished and confident as a man who believed spectacle favored him, flanked by hired strength, and he met the judge's reading with a smile thin enough to cut. The ledgers were read aloud, names named, theft detailed, and the sheriff presented a warrant reinforced by public testimony so that Coin could not easily buy forgetting. Tempers frayed, and the first warning shot that cracked the noon was meant to threaten rather than kill, and it changed the hour into a place where choices sharpened into action. Caleb moved as he had planned, closing distance to shorten violence and force witness into being. In that motion, the town chose to act as law rather than audience, and the hired men scattered with more haste than mastery. Hargrove fled again, but not without consequence, and by evening dust had settled into different patterns, The town had paid for the price of standing, but had gained something fragile and new. Clara took the governess's letter and held it to her chest like a talisman, while Caleb folded the judge's papers into his coat. Hope remained delicate and real because the cost of protecting it had been paid in courage and witness. They held small victories like lanterns, lighting paths forward while cautious hope stitched each neighbor to the promise of safer mornings together and steadied heart. Caleb stepped into Main Street, where snow had been tamped into a hard sheet that glittered like bone in bright light. The square gathered itself around the moment as if breath had been loaned to everyone present. Pine Ridge stopped being a scatter of houses and became a room that would not look away. He held a rifle because a man from the mountains knows the weight of precise decisions and how a cold barrel steadies a shaking hand. Hargrove stood opposite, with shoulders back and chin lifted in the way of men who measure worth by coin and rumor. His face had that slick, practiced composure that buys favors and pays silence while polishing cruelty with a smile. Neighbors clustered behind doors and under eaves, but people had also stepped out and gathered at windows until the street was rimmed with faces. Snow crunched under boots and the bell in the steeple made a slow, reluctant sound. Waking iron words were few because accusations do their work without needing music. Caleb did not raise his voice, but he let his posture say what talk might hide. Hargrove's nostrils flared when contempt met refusal in a man who would not barter truth. He barked the first accusation like a man flinging down a gauntlet. "You took my wife. You took my name." He spat as if repetition could forge claim. Caleb answered precisely and without flourish, "You lost both yourself. Not I." The exchange was a measured wind that pointed toward danger. As surely as lightning marks the tallest pine, Hargrove lunged forward with a shout that tried to gather law to his side like dogs gathering scraps. A gun flashed without much thought, and the air split with two shots that took different roads. One bullet found Caleb's side and cut him with fire that tasted of salt and iron. Another hit Hargrove in the shoulder and crumpled the swagger that money had given him. Hargrove lurched like a struck animal, then fumbled for something small at his waist and moved with the slyness of a man who keeps tricks tucked under smiles. He drew a hidden derringer and aimed for a moment that would make a hero out of spite. Gun's muzzle rose and the town inhaled as if 100 lungs had learned to hold in one long motion. At that instant a rifle cracked from the sheriff's shoulder, and the bullet struck true into Hargrove's hand while the derringer fell useless into the snow. The sheriff had stood the line between and neighborly fear and finally let duty take the place of rent. Hargrove sagged the pistol, clattering his face, a portrait of surprise and the slow unspooling of a man who believed consequence could be bought. Silence came down like a clean sheet, and then noise rushed back in with running feet, urgent voices. Clara broke from the crowd as if every step toward him was a reclaiming of breath, and she flung herself at Caleb with hands that trembled and eyes that pleaded for a life without being measured by another man's ledger. "You must not die on me," she sobbed into his coat while snow stuck to her lashes and her hair smelled of smoke and wet wool. Caleb felt the sting of impact where the bullet had grazed and the odd steadying of pain that lets a man know he will live if he breathes slow and keeps time with hope. The doctor reached him before fear could calcify and found the wound clean enough to promise recovery and bad enough to remind everyone present that courage has costs. Hargrove's guards faltered when the sheriff moved to cuff and read rights with a voice that trembled but did not break. The ledgers that had been spread on the judge's table earlier that week, now circulate in the open air like proof. Finally allowed to be seen, neighbors pointed to names, to duplicate slips, to freight lists that showed weight where none remained, and accounts that balanced only when definition changed to suit greed. A murmur swelled into words, and words hardened into facts, and the thick scaffolding that had propped Hargrove's empire began to list like a leaky barge. Men who had been paid in favors found their faces wet with cold and shame, and the arithmetic of deception did not hold against witnesses who would not be bought. Hargrove tried to scream that he had been maligned, that his influence assured him favor, but his voice sounded hollow under the weight of open books and witnesses who had seen goods vanish on routes he controlled. The sheriff read charges aloud in the center of the square, and the crowd edged closer so they could hear the exact accounting of crimes. Previously whispered proof took the shape of names and dates, and the sound of receipts rustled like small flags that marked wrongs. Finally named, some who had stood silent before stepped up and described patterns in freight, in payments, in threats that had been delivered in town alleys and behind closed doors. A hired man confessed under the cold clarity of day how crates had been counted down and cargo shifted when Hargrove's ledger required profits where none should be. The judge, who had listened and waited for evidence, declared that the law must be seen to do its work, and placed Hargrove under arrest where shadow could not hide him. Still, Hargrove's allies reached for coin and rumor and violence, and the square tightened like a fist ready to open or to strike. Caleb felt his ribs ache and heard Clara's low breathing, as if it were a map back to the things that mattered enough to suffer. For he wanted not to be a legend, but to be a man who kept his promise and who would wake to mornings where a woman's name meant liberty, not ownership. The deputies moved to secure the perimeter, and men who had come with Hargrove saw the sway of public resolve and turned to better options. Flight shots had been fired and blood had been shown, but the greater wound Hargrove had inflicted was being catalogued, and witnesses found courage in common purpose. As the sheriff tied cuffs to wrists, Hargrove glared and cursed and tried the old threats that had once bent shopkeepers and clerks. The townsfolk had learned how to refuse the old currency of fear. Caleb sagged against a post with Clara's hand warm in his and the ache in his side. A steady reminder that consequence exacts a price even when it falls for right reasons. People started to talk about rebuilding, about what it meant to have law that served anyone who arrived with truth, and the word hope moved in the crowd like an ember. Passed carefully, Hargrove's goods were inventoried on the spot, and men unrolled maps and lists until expectant faces recognized patterns of theft and manipulation. They had accepted because they thought contest impossible. By afternoon, Hargrove's control had picked seams and left town like a peeled skin, revealing rotten cloth beneath. Have you seen justice triumph against all odds? Share a moment that restored your hope and tell us in the comments. Spring arrived slowly and honestly on the peaks, melting snow into silver threads that ran between stones and promised new growth. Caleb packed saddlebags with careful hands and wrapped a wool cloak around Clara, because silk bowed before the wind. They left Pine Ridge without fanfare, only the steady rhythm of hooves and the soft clink of tack, carrying what could be carried and leaving coin and ledger behind like old weather. Their cabin sat on a shelf beneath tall pines where the sun reached long in afternoons, and work began the moment feet touched fresh wood. They chose a small clearing and set beams true, fit a door that would not complain with gusts, thatched a roof to keep rain honest, and stacked wood in cribs shaped to shed water. Clara learned to splice rope and tan hides, until leather softened into something useful. Caleb showed her where trout hid in eddies, and how to set a fly so a fish might be tempted and forgive it. Silk became a memory folded into cedar. She kept a scrap as a relic, then sewed it into a lining that made a coat warmer, and carried the past without letting it burn. The present. She traded collars for aprons, finding relief that had no need for apology. Caleb learned to boil sap for sugar and to stitch a roof that would not leak under heavy snow. Their days were small, exact tasks that wove lives together, mending a boot before frost, sharpening knives before hunts, carrying water in morning light. Neighbors arrived in honest visits, traders descending with flour, a woman with a sick child, a boy wanting to learn knots. They received such people with plain hospitality, dinner and a bed when needed, and payment when able. Stories moved along those roads. Travelers spoke of the trapper who had carried a bride out of a burning stable into a life that refused to be owned. Each telling added color, until the children sat with wide eyes and asked for more nights. Caleb and Clara found a rhythm that did not require drama. Mornings carved in light, afternoons smelling of sap and soil, evenings where tea warmed hands, and conversation moved like a slow They argued once about shelf height and later laughed until their fingers were cold. They learned to forgive small faults and hold steadier in hard hours. Love became practical acts. Wood stacked tight, a jacket thrown over shoulders, a hand held a moment longer crossing eyes. Seasons taught patience and measured joy. Winters tested preparation and summers fed stores. Spring returned each year with small celebrations. A first thaw, crocus through snow, the first fish biting, and the cabin filled with laughs that come from living through trouble and deciding to keep going. They hosted neighbors with bowls of stew and sent smoked trout and leatherwork to homesteads. In time, their choice reached Pine Ridge. Hargrove's name loosened like a stone weathered by rain. Men who trafficked in silence found new trades. Markets shifted. The town told new stories that included the woman once called a bride without a voice, who now taught children to braid and to mend. People who had looked away before now nodded when the couple passed. A small restitution. Sometimes a neighbor arrived with news of a man asking after Hargrove, and they would sit over a kettle and agree on careful answers, not with violence, but with witness, names and dates that prevented lies. They kept the silk in cedar, folded and soft, not from need but choice. When children asked if the tale was true, Caleb and Clara said plainly, "Yes, it is true, but the truth is not a climax. It is a practice." As years lengthened, little things became proof. A birdhouse Caleb carved that still held nests, curtains Clara stitched that blew in the breeze, visitors who left with pockets heavier with kindness than payment. They kept rituals, a morning coffee, a walk to the ridge when light slanted right, a sharing of small tasks that became a language of care. They kept quiet watches some nights and loud celebrations on others. When people came down from the valley for directions or news, they heard plain facts and small cautions: how to set a latch that would not freeze, where to find clean water, and why it matters to speak up when a wrong is seen instead of making silence profitable. The legend became useful. Courage combined with community renders intimidation powerless, because it cannot be bought. Their life testified not with banners, but with hospitality and steady work. Late one summer, Clara walked to a place where the ridge opened to the valley and watched smoke rise from chimneys below, thinking of those who had helped them in small, practical ways. Caleb stood beside her and they watched until stars found their places, and they counted how many winters they had kept warm against storms. She nudged him with an elbow, and they laughed over a memory of a child who would not sleep. Years later, the cabin held signs of long use: a shelf of patched books, a basket of yarn by the window, a birdhouse that still hosted nests. Once a child's muddy boot left a print on the floor, and a small voice asked for porridge. That sound rearranged mornings and set a new joy into routine. Guests arrived with needs and left with knowledge: how to cure fever with willow, how to stitch a boot, how to braid a rope that would not fail. Their story traveled along trade routes and markets. Travelers retold it not as spectacle but as instruction. Courage combined with community can unmake a tyrant. Those who once looked away found ways to help, sharing seed, offering testimony, standing where silence had been expected. Hargrove's reach thinned as markets and courts took notice, and truth did its slow work. One evening after harvest, Clara stood on the porch with a steaming mug while dusk smudged the valley. A visiting child begged for the tale, and she obliged, smiling. When she reached the part that first brought two strangers back together, she turned to Caleb with a mischievous glance and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" He set his mug down, wiped his hands, and answered without pause, "You're my home." Laughter rose warm and true. If their choice moves you, subscribe and share your favorite love story in the comments. Tell how someone steady helped you in a dark hour, and keep these quiet beacons lit for others seeking courage and warm heart. Pass this tale to someone who needs it tonight, and stand ready when neighbors ask for help. Always.